This place rules. I am so excited to be here. I know the Science Gallery has only been around for 3 years, but its reputation has truly reached across the pond to America, and people there are aware that there is an amazing new place doing stuff that is innovative and interesting and different here in Dublin. And so I'm truly honored to be here and to have an opportunity to talk with you guys. Michael John mentioned that we share a passion for this 17th century oddball, Athanasius Kircher. Kircher, among his many attributes, ran what was very certainly the coolest museum in the world in the second half of the 17th century. And I'm quite certain that the Science Gallery is modeled after it. And so it's wonderful to see Kircher's museum recreated in the 21st century. So I guess I should begin by telling you that there is a very, very strange competition that's held every year, every spring in New York City, called the United States Memory Championship. And at this contest, people get together and try to remember the most lines of poetry, the most random numbers, the most names of total strangers. One of the events they compete in, they memorize a deck of playing cards, a shuffled deck of playing cards in perfect order. And I showed up as a science journalist a few years back to cover this contest, assuming that it was probably going to be like this collection of, I assumed it was going to be the Super Bowl of savants, freaks of nature, people with photographic memory. I don't know. That's not what I found. The people who competed in this contest all professed to have just average memories. And they all claimed that they had trained themselves to perform these absolutely amazing feats of memory. And I was like, no way. That's just unbelievable. And I was standing outside the competition hall with a guy named Ed Cook, who had one of the best trained memories in England. And he had come over as sort of like a warm-up for the World Championships, which are going to be held that summer in Oxford. And he was smoking a cigarette. This guy smokes way too many cigarettes. I don't know if that's one of your tests out there, what cigarette smoke does to your memory. Apparently, it doesn't hurt this guy's. I mean, he's like a smokestack. And he said to me, in a characteristically British way, "You're a journalist. Do you know Britney Spears?" I was like, "No." "Why?" He said, I really want to teach Britney Spears how to memorize a deck of playing cards on U.S. national television. It'll prove to the world that anyone can do this." And I was like, well, I don't know Britney Spears, but maybe you could teach me. I mean, you got to start somewhere. And that was the beginning of a journey for me. I ended up spending the better part of the next year training my memory, also investigating it, trying to understand how it works, why it sometimes doesn't work, and what its potential might be. And I met amnesiacs and savants, legitimate savants, and scientists, and had my own brain sort of tested and probed in various ways. And one of the things that I learned, which I found kind of surprising, was that this idea of having a trained, cultivated, disciplined memory, of laboriously furnishing one's mind systematically, was once not nearly so alien an idea as it would seem to us today. That once upon a time, people actually invested in their memories in the way that we invest in, stuff. And over the last 3 or 4 millennia, we've invented a series of technologies, and I use technology in the broadest possible sense to encapsulate everything from the alphabet to the BlackBerry to whatever amazing thing Apple is going to invent next, which I don't even want to think about, but I probably want, that have essentially allowed us to outsource this very essential human act of remembering. And it's an old story, and it's changed us, and it's changed how we think about memory. It's changed how we think about memory from a cultural perspective, and it's changed us cognitively, I would argue. 2,500 years ago, Socrates was up in arms about this brand new invention, relatively new invention, called writing. And he said, writing is going to ruin us because people are going to start taking their memories out of their minds, putting them down on papyrus, and they're going to start forgetting. People are going to become like empty vessels, and the culture is headed down a terrible, treacherous precipice that we will not be able to recover from. Thank goodness somebody had the good sense to write this down. Otherwise, we would have no knowledge of it. Thank you very much, Plato. And from our perspective today, most of us would say that Socrates was overstating the case. And yet, I think we all can identify that there's some nugget of truth in what he was worried about. This idea that by taking our memories outside of ourselves and externalizing them, that this was changing us in some way. And it certainly changed the notion of what it meant to be erudite. If you were a scholar in, well, say 2,500 years ago in Greece, if you were consulting a text, chances were there weren't that many copies of it in existence, and a premium was placed on actually remembering, on internalizing what you'd read. Of course, Gutenberg came along and printed books proliferated, and suddenly the printed page could remember for you. And the notion of what it meant to be smart changed. It became no longer about having all of this stuff in your mind, but knowing how to access and navigate this labyrinthine world of external memory. You might argue that today, the notion of erudition is changing yet again. We no longer have to even know how to navigate that world of external memories. All we have to know is the right set of search terms. So one of the last places on Earth where this idea of investing in one's memory still has any hold on people's minds is at this rather bizarre, singular competition called the U.S. Memory Championship. It's actually not that singular. There are contests in about a dozen countries around the world. There is a veritable memory circuit that culminates every summer in a world championship. And I thought this was all really fascinating and ended up getting kind of obsessed with it. And I should explain that this sport of competitive memorizing is driven by a kind of arms race, where every year somebody comes up with a new way of remembering more stuff more quickly. It's almost always somebody in Europe. I have to tell you, the Brits are extremely into this. I don't know what that says about the English national character that they take this so seriously, but they are only surpassed by the Germans, for whom this is this massages some sort of a G-spot at the center of the Teutonic soul. They have high school championships and regional championships and state championships and national championships, and the German memory champion is like a national celebrity. He appears on TV. Women throw their panties at him. They ask him, "Please, can you sign our bosom?" And he's like, "No, I don't carry around a pen. I'm the German memory champion." Anyways, in America, it's not quite that advanced, at least not yet. And so while there is this arms race, all of the techniques that are basically used in this contest come down to a fundamental principle of psychology known as elaborative encoding. The idea is, how do you take information that is otherwise meaningless, otherwise unimportant to you, and transform it in some way to make it memorable? And this is a point illustrated very well by a famous paradox in psychology known as the Baker-Baker paradox. It goes like this. If you tell two people to remember the same word, Baker, you tell one person, remember that there is a guy whose name is Baker, like his last name is Baker, capital B, and you tell somebody else, remember that there is a guy who is a baker, and you come back to him a bit later, and you say, remember I gave you that word a while back, do you remember what it was? The person who is told the guy's name is Baker is less likely to remember the same word as the person who was told his profession was Baker. Very strange. Same word, different amount of remembering. Why is that? Well, the name Baker doesn't mean anything. There's nothing to tether it to all the other things that are floating around in our mind. It has no significance. The word baker, the profession baker, well, we know bakers. Bakers wear funny white hats. They have hands that are caked in flour. They smell good when they come home from work. We might even know a baker. And so there are all of these associational hooks that get latched into that word when we hear it. The entire art of this sport of competitive memorizing is in turning capital B bakers into lowercase b bakers. That's one of the events, is memorizing the first and last names of 100 people. They give you headshots with their names under them, and you have 15 minutes. In fact, I'm told that they now give you 200 because 100 was just too easy. And the way that these competitors are doing that, and the way that one can actually remember names better in real life, is by turning those capital B bakers into lowercase b bakers, figuring out ways to tie the name of a person in some way that is richer, has more associational hooks to the person's face. Now, one of the more elaborate techniques that's used in these memory competitions goes back to ancient Greece, supposedly to a discovery that was made by a Greek poet named Simonides in the 5th century BC. The story, as was told by Cicero, is that Simonides was attending a banquet, and he was like the hired poet on hand. He stood up and he gave his ode to the king, stepped back down, walked out the door. The minute he passes through the threshold, the entire building collapses, kills everybody inside, not only kills everybody, but mangles the bodies beyond all recognition, such that they can't even say like who was sitting where. Nobody can be properly buried. It's one tragedy compounding another. And Simonides closes his eyes and has this realization, which is that in his mind's eye, he's able to see where each of the guests at the banquet was sitting. And what he figured out in that moment is something that we all kind of intuitively know, which is that as bad as we are at remembering phone numbers and people's names, we're actually pretty good at spatial memory. If you were to come over to my apartment in New Haven, Connecticut, and if you were the kind of nosy person who, when my back was turned, went and opened up all sorts of doors and like looked in my medicine cabinet, you would walk out of my apartment after just a few minutes remembering where the stove was, where the bathroom was, where the sofa was. That's actually a lot of information if you think about it. And we don't register that as a memory feat. But what Simonides realized was, what if instead of remembering, where Josh's sofa was, or the guests at the banquet table, what if instead of guests, it was imagery representing each of the words of one of his poems? Or what if it was every great Greek dramatist sitting in order of birth? Well, he would have remembered that instead. And so this technique, which came to be known as the memory palace, was once widely known and widely practiced. Students were taught not just what to remember, but how to remember it. And this was the same technique that Cicero used to memorize his speeches, that medieval scholars used to memorize entire books. One of the things that I find so fascinating is, because I really dove into some of these classical Latin memory treatises, medieval memory treatises, things that were written thousands, sometimes thousands of years ago on the subject of memory. These people understood so much that we have only kind of rediscovered in the 20th century with modern cognitive science about how the brain works, how memory works, what is memorable, and they were applying it in their actual lives. They didn't have the terminology that we have, but they understood quite a bit, and quite a bit that was lost. So, like I said, I got kind of obsessed with this, really fascinated, and decided I was going to try and train my own memory. And I had a coach from England, this guy Ed Cook, who I had met, who was smoking the cigarettes, teach me everything he knew about this subject, take me under his wings, and just teach me all of these ancient techniques. And I ended up coming back a year later to the same contest that I had covered as a science journalist, and competed, sort of like as an exercise in participatory journalism. I had thought I was going to write something about this bizarre subculture, and the only way to get inside the minds of these people was to actually try and do it myself, because I have to tell you, one of these contests is like, it's like a lot of people staring at a piece of paper, and it's sort of the most dramatic it gets is like when somebody massages their temples. So from a journalist perspective, that is incredibly frustrating. You're like, tell me something, give me something that I can write about. So the only way I could figure out how to write about it was to actually do it. And I entered the contest, and I won, which really wasn't supposed to happen. And not only did I win, I actually set a new US record at the time by memorizing a deck of playing cards in 1 minute and 40 seconds, which sometimes sounds impressive to people. There was no gasp of amazement just now, but occasionally there's a gasp of amazement. But I have to explain that by the standards of the international memory circuit, it's actually pretty unimpressive. The record right now is for memorizing the precise order of a shuffled deck of playing cards is 21.9 seconds. Oh, so now you gasped. I gasped too, actually. Keep in mind, this is somebody who has no innate talent for this. This is somebody who trained himself to perform this incredible feat. In fact, there was a study in Nature not that long ago that looked at the brains of... They actually brought 8 memory champions into the lab, and tried to figure out what's different about these people. You know, maybe you're familiar, there's a famous study of London cabbies. They found that London cabbies had slightly enlarged hippocampi as a result of all of that driving around that crazy city of London. They thought maybe the brains of these memory champions are somehow different. Well, anatomically, structurally, no. There was no difference. They thought maybe they are smarter in some way. And they gave them IQ tests and spatial reasoning tests and all these cognitive tests, and they found that basically these people were more or less average. There was, however, one striking difference, and that was when they put these individuals into an fMRI chamber and had them memorize stuff, regions of the brain were lighting up that were not lighting up in control subjects. What regions of the brain? These people were engaging spatial memory in the act of remembering. Well, we understand why they were doing that. They were walking around these imagined buildings, these memory palaces in their mind's eye, and that was what made them different. They were using their memories differently. So I won this contest, which really wasn't supposed to happen. Found myself in the very, very weird position of being the official representative of the United States of America, greatest superpower on planet Earth. Sorry. With the hopes and dreams of 300 million people resting on my shoulders, to having now to attend the World Memory Championships, which was a weird spot to find myself in. And I decided, all right, I got to take this seriously. Like, Uncle Sam is depending on it. So I had my wife do up a pair of earmuffs with the kind of Captain America Easy Rider. I didn't want anybody to be mistaken about who the Yankee in the room was. I need to explain, in a memory contest, everybody wears earmuffs. It is all about concentration. Usually people will wear earplugs underneath their earmuffs because there is no such thing as deaf enough in a memory competition. And so they'll wear the earmuffs, which I'll take off because I can't even hear myself in them. And then the people who are most obsessed with this, who are competing at the highest level, it's almost exclusively the Germans, I should say. It's true. Wear blinders. Some of them actually compete wearing horse blinders, literally right off a horse from Central Park. I did up a pair of safety goggles, painted them black, drilled 2 holes in them, and I trained in these. This was how I made sure I kept out any extraneous visual stimuli, auditory stimuli. This is how I focused. So despite all of my excellent apparel, I went to the championship, and I'm sorry to say, gave the world an entirely unimpressive impression of American collective memory. Got my tush wiped, primarily by the Brits, the Germans, and the Malaysians. But I am very pleased to say that I whooped the French guy. So maybe we should open this up to some questions.
So thanks so much. Would you like to grab a seat there?
Yeah.
Thanks for that wonderful talk. And I suppose the first thing that I'd like to ask before I open it up to the floor would be, is this actually useful? I mean, outside of the refined environment of the memory championship,
right.
how can you use your newfound superpower?
Right. So it's handy to remember people's names. That actually comes in handy in real life. It is occasionally handy to remember shopping lists, and every once in a while you actually are called upon to use your memory in everyday life. But there is an important distinction that needs to be made, that was made by the original Roman memory treatises, which is between natural memory and artificial memory. This is one of the ways in which they really got it 2,000 years ago. They said, you've got this natural memory, which is sort of what you're born with. It's like the hardware. You're kind of stuck with it. And there's not really that much you can do about it. Artificial memory is what you're able to do with that natural memory. It's what you can do with techniques and training, not to improve your memory, but to use your memory better. So I guess that's a partial answer.
I mean, if you're trying to remember a shopping list, are you really going to create a memory palace and walk around it?
I do. And I'll tell you why. Because having been this, I was a veritable mnemonic Lou Ferrigno when I was competing in this. I was a real well-oiled machine. And since hanging up my cleats, my powers have diminished. And I'm no longer this incredible mental athlete that I was at the time. But I want to keep it up a little bit. I'm like that sad, 45-year-old football player who thinks that he can make a comeback. Right. So I remember my shopping list just to keep myself in shape.
And is there a bit of a gender divide in these memory competitions? I mean, from your stories, it seems like it's mostly men, or is it?
So this is a question I get all the time. People are like, this sounds like a bunch of men who can't remember what a woman is. And that's actually not true. In fact, there's almost always a woman who finishes in the top 3 or 4 every year. Here's the thing. I don't want to overgeneralize, and I'm probably at risk of doing this, but my impression is that the women who compete in this sport are the more natural talents. They come in, they seem to have trained less, they seem to be more nonchalant about it, and they always do really well. The problem is the women always have something better to do with their lives. They end up going to medical school or law school or becoming journalists, and then they don't come back, and the men come back year after year after year after year and get better and better and better and better.
And just one last question before I open it up to the floor, and I'm sure we have lots of questions. What would be your advice if someone wanted to just take the first step in training their memory in this way?
There's a wonderful book that I can recommend called Moonwalking with Einstein. That's the first step. Yeah. The second step is reading it. No, in all seriousness, I mean, it's not a how-to book, but I explain what the process that I went through, and hopefully there's something people can take from that.
And just to mention, to put in the plug, thanks to our good friends in Penguin, we actually have some copies of the book here, which Josh has very kindly agreed to sign for people if they're interested after the event. So now I would like to hand it over to the floor. Any questions? Yes, in the front row.
So,
maybe could you just repeat it into the microphone? And
when you talk about using your spatial memory in order to remember lists of things, do you always use the same space?
The answer is absolutely not. The people who compete in this world are all collectors of architecture. They will walk into a building and size it up and say, is this a potentially memorable building? It's a very strange criteria on which to evaluate architecture. And if it is, they will walk around it and make sure that they've got it implanted in their minds so that they can save it to use as a repository for other memories.
So is it better always to use a different place?
Always, yes, because the last thing you want to have happen is have an image that you had remembered at some contest, or when you were training 6 months ago, accidentally pop up when you're trying to very, very quickly remember a list of 400 words or, the first chapter of the first book of Paradise Lost or whatever it is. So you have to have many, many memory palaces. And my favorite story, my favorite memory geek of all time was this guy who lived in the 15th century. He was an Italian jurist who had literally thousands of memory palaces, and he filled them each with quotes and sources on any given topic he ever wanted to be able to expound upon. So if he was having
Camilo?
No, this is not Camilo. He might be this is my second favorite memory geek. This is Peter Verbenna, and he wanted to speak extemporaneously on the subject of torts or armadillos or whatever the thing was that he had, he would reach into the right memory chamber and pull out the information that he had stocked away, which I find kind of amazing.
And have any people tried to actually build physical memory palaces, or is that
right? So there, in fact, this is how Michael John was just talking about. This guy Giulio Camillo, who was in the 16th century one of the most famous men in Europe by some measure. Absolutely divinely loopy, and people, as you know, who had some pretty misguided, crazy ideas, did well for themselves during that period. And he said, okay, this is a wonderful idea, this memory palace, but let's make it real. Let's build a memory palace. Let's build a gigantic wooden structure. He imagined it was going to be shaped like an amphitheater, and that you would stand in the middle of it, and by looking up at all of these portraits and paintings and boxes filled with information, one would simply have all of the knowledge of the cosmos directed straight into you, and you would become a walking genius. Sounds crazy, but he had massive government funding from the King of France, and apparently had commissioned several famous artists to be involved in the project. And I wish there was we should rebuild Giulio Camillo's memory palace at
absolutely
at the Science Gallery.
Other question? Yes, back there, my dad.
Hello, I'm glad you remembered. I'm just talking about memory from the point of view of the older person. Because, of course, one of the things about memory is that as you go through life, you keep on accumulating year by year more and more things to remember. And so, and at a certain stage in life, no matter how healthy your mind is, it starts disappearing. And is there any reason for this? That all this, does your mind have any system in it? For example, I know from personal experience that certain things go, other things don't go. Which is intriguing. For example, names of plants in Latin, I have difficulty with, though I may have had huge numbers of them in the past. Names in English, easy. And the other thing is that memory also can deteriorate in another way, and that is that you remember things, and it becomes increasingly evident that what you remember is an absurd version of what really happened.
Yeah.
So, can you throw any light on any of this?
Yes, you've asked several questions there. It's true. First of all, to talk about what you were speaking of at the end, one of the things that is demonstrably true about memory is that as we revisit memories, we're in a way re-engaging them and reactivating them in the context of being a slightly different person from the person we were last time we reactivated that memory. And over time, the distance between what actually happened and what we remember to have happened can grow to be quite large. In terms of forgetting, forgetting is like a real biological process that happens at the level of the cell, and it's real, and there's when we don't revisit information, it can fade over time. So where was I going with that?
Just what you said reminds me of Robin Dunbar and the Dunbar number, and the idea that people supposedly can only have, I think it's 150 friends.
Right.
And so he's sort of skeptical about people with more than 150 friends on Facebook or whatever, right. Because apparently he claims that that's really due to a memory limitation. And I mean, it's
Memory
that
camps.
you know, because friends require large. You know, each friend actually requires quite a lot of memory, and he also claims that people with larger families can actually accommodate less friends because some of the family members take up friend space. So, I wonder with your kind of technique, there's no sort of inherent limitations, are there?
For memory champs, actually can only have about 9 friends, but that's for other social reasons.
Right.
Yeah.
Other questions? Yes. Is there anyone who isn't a family member of mine who would like to ask a question?
We're all here. My question is, I'm just wondering, because the memory tests and this competition, it seems to be a very specific type of memory, by rote memory, which I don't know about its wider applications. And I wonder, because I think of actors and that, and their ability to memorize, and I don't know that, I've talked to actors who, I know one actor who can recite Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness from start to finish, and he did this show. I don't think he was doing it by wandering around a memory palace. So I'm wondering if there is other types of memory that you can use and possibly have broader applications, because remembering a deck of cards, whilst it's impressive, I don't know if it's necessarily a sign of a greater intellect.
You've never been with me to Vegas. No, what you're saying is absolutely true, and I don't want to. The book is about a lot more than just these narrow techniques about memory in a broader sense. And one of the things I talk about is actors, and many actors use what's known as a technique known as method acting. Right, they are associating essentially emotional content, physical content, a sort of a reason for each beat, each line, each section that they're trying to remember of a script. And what they're doing is what I was talking about. They are figuring out, this is not for the sake of remembering scripts, they're doing this to be better actors. But what they're doing is associating emotion, associating kinesthetic movement with the lines that they're trying to remember, and it makes them better rememberers. It is true that if you tell somebody to remember the word pick up a pencil, the phrase pick up a pencil, and you tell somebody else to remember the phrase pick up a pencil while they're picking up a pencil, the second person will remember it better. And that's kind of, in a bigger picture, what's going on with actors remembering scripts. I will say about Heart of Darkness, though, only because you bring it up, I went to a high school in the South Bronx of the U.S. This is basically the toughest neighborhood in America. Half the kids don't graduate high school. There's a teacher who uses these sorts of memory techniques to teach his kids basically the U.S. history curriculum. And I sat in the back of this classroom and watched him ask a question about, I think it was about 19th century mercantilistic policy or something, and a kid recited a paragraph from Heart of Darkness by heart as part of his answer, a long essay-length answer about 19th century mercantilism. No, I don't think it was very easy for this guy, no, but this was something that he had committed himself to do, and that this teacher has tried to instill in his students.
Do you think, Josh, that there's... we talk a lot about how we need to move on from an education system that's based on rote learning and memorizing and so on, and it's a debate we have a lot in Ireland about, our education and our exam systems a lot of them are based on kind of regurgitation of memories. But do you think actually when you need to look at it from the other side, and we need to kind of create new ways to educate people to remember?
It's funny. In America, memory is like a 4-letter word in education, right? Mm-hmm. I don't think I was asked to memorize. I was asked to memorize, I think, the Gettysburg Address, and maybe Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, and maybe soliloquy from Hamlet in my entire, 17 years of education in America. And this is probably a good thing to a certain extent. Once upon a time, schooling, at least in America, was dreadful. It was boring as hell. It was a lot of rote memorization. And progressive education reform, changed that because we want to create kids who are abstract thinkers and creative thinkers. But the stuff swings like a pendulum, and I think we're starting to realize that kids are going out into the world without like a core set of facts, that you need to be a curious person, to be somebody who can have new ideas about the world, make new connections. The Latin root inventio is the source of two words in the English language. One is invention, and the other is inventory. And one of the things that I was surprised to learn was the extent to which people used to believe that it was so crucial that you have an inventory of old ideas if you were going to invent anything new. That's what being a creative thinker was plucking from distant patches and making connections.
There's a question up there at the back, yeah?
It's to tie in with the Irish education system, I think. We in Ireland are absolutely brilliant in our exam systems of learning things off. And I was just wondering if your technique is there a difference? And after an exam, I wouldn't remember anything because I move on to the next block of information I had to learn off. Is there a difference between kind of short-term and long-term memory with what you do?
Well, again, talking about sort of what the ancients had figured out was kind of forgotten is, look, yeah, we teach kids to like remember up until the next exam, get it right, and then like move on. And that's because it's like drill, rote. But what these techniques are about, in the broadest possible sense, is figuring out, okay, no. Let's figure out how to make this information colorful, meaningful, significant. Let's figure out how to give it structure such that it will hopefully be stickier.
There's a question right at the back there. You've been waiting for a while, sorry. Yeah.
I'm just wondering, were there any physical effects when you were in training? Like, did you need more sleep? Did you eat differently? Did you have to take more exercise or anything? Did your head hurt?
So there are, I think, two things that unite people who compete in this sport. One is that they tend to be people who have like strange imaginations. Right? The whole art of this is coming up with these crazy associations as quickly as possible. And so the real skill that you're training is the ability to do that very quickly. That's one thing. The other thing that tends to unite the people who are involved in this world is that an overwhelming number of them are not just mental athletes, but physical athletes. These are people who really like to push themselves and push their bodies and push their mind to see how far they can go. The guy who won the U.S. championship this past year, and I was there again, this time as a spectator again, is at this very moment on the side of Mount Everest. Because what else would you do after winning the U.S. Memory Championship but climb Mount Everest?
The question here. Yeah.
My question is, look, is there such a thing as a photographic or eidetic memory? And, I've also read about, the Aborigines in Australia having a really very different way of looking at things and memorizing things. And, if there is a photographic memory, where do they enter the World Memory Championship and how do they do?
Okay.
I read about John von Neumann as a kid, and he's meant to be able to memorize a page of a telephone book by looking at it. But it doesn't seem to correlate with anything else, when you read stories like that.
So there are two great questions there. The first is about photographic memory. And there's actually a distinction between photographic memory and eidetic memory. Eidetic memory is actually a perceptual kind of thing where basically a vivid afterimage lingers in your mind's eye. It's more common in children, very, very rare in adults to find this. But true photographic memory, people who are able to actually make like a Xerox copy with their mind and reproduce it later, it simply does not exist. It is a myth. There is exactly one case in the scientific literature. It's a paper published in Nature in 1970 of somebody who had this kind of photographic memory. Afterwards, scientists put out ads all over the world in the London Times, the Philadelphia Inquirer. If you have a photographic memory, come forward now. And some people came forward, but not a one of them could perform this nifty trick in the lab or with a scientist looking over their shoulder. And I think the best possible evidence that this doesn't exist is that if it did, somebody would come and compete in one of these memory contests and just wipe the floor. And it's never happened. So, with regard to the Aborigines seem to have invented mean, a number of cultures around the world invented techniques like the memory palace, but were totally unrelated, homologous strategies that they were tapping into. And Aborigines, I've been told, will tell their cultural stories, their great oral epics across the landscape, and tie pieces of the story to this hill over here, this mountain over here, this stream, and kind of read the story off the landscape, which is in a way a kind of memory palace. And the tragic thing is that when you then lose your land, you lose not only territory, but memories, cultural memories, collective memories, which is especially tragic.
There's one here and then over here. Yeah, here first. Yeah. Can you speak into the microphone? Thanks.
I would have been disappointed had you been using notes, but I was just curious in your research on memories of pleasure and pain. Somewhere along the line, because my memory isn't good, I don't remember who said it, but the pain had no memory. I was just wondering the euphoric recall, why it's so strong, as opposed to, say, memories that aren't pleasurable.
Right. So this is not a subject I got into in the book particularly, but it is an interesting subject. I mean, things that are emotionally resonant are more. Actually, I guess it is a subject I got into in the book. Are more memorable, and that actually has to do with physiologically things that are happening in the brain in terms of regions associated with emotions. Basically, saying to regions associated with memory, hey, this is important, hold on to this. So I don't know if that's a partial answer to your question.
Up here? Yeah.
Your memory palace sounds a bit like where computer systems are going now with their interfaces. Is that the right direction, or is it a hindrance or crutch for us?
Interesting. There is an argument that's been made, actually, that the original Windows operating system was modeled, on the Mac operating system, but there's another argument that the original Mac operating system was informed by the memory palace of Giulio Camillo. I don't know if it's an entirely convincing argument, but it's kind of fascinating. Yeah, I think there are principles at work in understanding what makes things memorable that are obviously directly applicable to interface design, and that I'm sure are implicitly, if not explicitly, helping us to, helping designers, UI, UX designers, make better interfaces. But interfaces are going to be a thing of the past anyways. The future of the externalization of memory is that we are going to have this distance between the things that we know that are up here, that are internal memories, and the things that are external memories is going to get smaller and smaller and smaller. That's going to be the story of the future. That right now, to get between my internal memory and my external memory, I still have to use my fingers and my eyes, and it's kind of clunky. I've been told that Apple, this could be a dirty rumor, has hired the leading expert on heads-up displays. iPhone 15.0 is going to be not a device we carry in our pockets, but a device that we wear on our glasses. And I suspect iPhone 30.0 is going to be channeled straight into our brains.
Yes. And then here after.
Hi, Josh. I was just wondering, there's probably a very quick answer to this, but if you found any particular type of information more difficult to remember, or if memory champs have a blind spot in particular, generally, or?
Yes. When it comes to remembering anything, the more abstract it is, the less concrete an idea, the harder it is to remember. If we gave a memory test and I gave half the room, told you to remember the words air, sophistication, courage, justice, and ask the other half of the room to remember the words rabbit, telephone, and earmuffs, this half of the room would do better. And there's an argument that's been made actually about ancient Greek oral poetry that if you look at like Homer, there are far fewer examples of Homer using this kind of abstract, right? Part of the reason it's like rosy-fingered dawn and everything is so visual in those epithets, and that you don't have words like justice, courage, bravery in the Odyssey and the Iliad. You have illustrations of justice, courage, and bravery. Those words only start really appearing in Greek with after writing. Did somebody just say no? 'Cause I'm not a Greek scholar. Anyways, because the argument is that those are harder things to imagine, to memorize, to remember.
There was a question here? Yeah.
Thanks. I've got two questions kind of related. When you were training, you were saying you're using earmuffs to block out sound. Is music in the background beneficial sometimes to memory, or does that depend on the person? Or is it just a hindrance? And the second question is, for musicians in general, what would be the best method for, say, memorizing pieces of music quickly and efficiently?
The answer to the first question is I have no idea. I guess my intuition is that having other stuff going on actually would not be useful. The answer to the second question, the memory of musicians, I mean, it is an interesting and curious fact worth commenting on that musicians tend to have pretty good memories for music, and that as you get to become a better and better musician, you tend to have a better and better memory for music. And this is true of all forms of expertise, right? Whether it's waiters remembering orders, or in one case, soccer players, looking at you can show expert soccer players, I mean, from like the Premier League, a TV screen with a soccer match on it, briefly, and they can reconstruct the dynamics of the game, where the players were, what was going on. The classic example is in chess. Chess grandmasters, at a certain point, it becomes basically trivial to remember chess positions. They can play games entirely in their mind's eye, sometimes many games at once. And a very good correlate of how good a chess player somebody is going to be is how good they are at memorizing chessboards. And here's what's really interesting. If you show a chessboard where the pieces have been randomly arranged to a chess grandmaster, their memory for that board is not much better than average. Same chessboard, this one they can look at and memorize, this one means nothing to them. And that's because it's noise. There's no meaning to it. They can't analyze it in the light of all the games they've played before. And that points to the fact that what expertise is accumulating this knowledge, this way of structuring information, of understanding information, in the case of a musician, of truly at a deep level understanding what is going on in the dynamics of a piece that actually aids in memory.
I think we have time for just two more questions. So there's one at the back there you've been waiting for a while, and then there was also a hand over here. Okay, we'll take three, then you're the last one. Thanks.
Hi. I just have a quick question about, we're bombarded with information at the moment, and the main culprits are advertising and television. Would these actually have an effect? Because with advertising, it is all about actually getting memory, or getting people to remember things. So you have like perpetrators like Harvey Nolan and stuff like that, who like have the theme tune that gets stuck in your head for the rest of your life. Does that actually have an effect on, like, so you have all this useless information, does that actually have an effect on how much valuable information that you'd have? Or do you get overloaded with these memory triggers that they actually sort of block out your ability to actually take on more relevant and useful information, the stuff that you want to remember?
I think it's a myth that like you put one thing in and another thing falls out, that you can't, there's like a limit to how much we can remember. In fact, I suspect the opposite is true, that sort of the more memory is like a spider web, and the bigger it grows, the more it catches, and that's why there is a relationship between or there seems to be, we intuit that there is a relationship between people who have a good memory and people who are kind of intelligent, because they have these ways of structuring information, of understanding information, that makes it easier for them to learn new stuff. So it's not the case that, you know, adding to that spider web somehow makes it crumble in other places. I don't think.
And then over here, there was a question at the back here, and then the last one there. Yeah. Who was it up here? There was, okay, maybe yourself then. Yeah. And then over here.
When people are doing yoga and when people are meditating, you know, they're connecting with the subconscious and the right hand part of the brain, you know, because in normal everyday life, if people are using the left hand side of the brain, you know, the logical and the rational and the analytic brain, you know, and when people go into what's called a state of flow or what they call the zone, or what Eckhart Tolle calls the power of now, you know, when they're going into an altered state of awareness or a higher state of consciousness, you know, and to say that, you know, they're not actually thinking, you know, their thinking is switched off, that they've got in touch with the purest part of their mind, you know, and the purest part of their being, and when you were talking about wearing the muffler and the glasses, you know, you're really connecting with the old, ancient part of the brain, aren't you?
Can you sort of just summarize in one?
Yeah, I can summarize.
Okay.
He's saying, aren't you, when you are all geared up with your goggles and your silly earmuffs, aren't you getting into a zone where you're kind of like in touch with, you're just like, it's just all flowing and it's awesome, and you're like basically achieving some sort of Buddhist ideal. I'm paraphrasing. Sorry. Yeah. Unfairly. The answer is actually, the secret to getting really good at this is the exact opposite. It is ensuring that you are not running on autopilot when you're doing this, that you are staying cognitively aware. This is a general truth about how experts get to be experts at what they do, is that when they practice, they are forcing themselves to essentially not be on autopilot, to be deliberately focused on what they're doing wrong, and what they can learn from what they're doing wrong. And that was a piece of advice that I got from, there's a whole field of research on how people get to be good at what they do that I dove into and talked to scientists in the process of doing this. I want to figure out how I could train my memory as efficiently and effectively as possible. And that was one of the things that I learned is so crucial, is that you have to not be on autopilot. You've got to be cognitive of what you're doing.
And do you think that also applies to like skiers and golfers and so on? Because people talk about the kind of flow state that expert skiers go into.
Right. So flow, when you're doing it, yes,
Yeah.
you're but when you're training,
yes.
I mean, the best figure skaters in the world, when they train, will focus on the jumps that they don't land.
Yeah.
Whereas lesser figure skaters do the jumps they can land. That's more fun. Amateur musicians play pieces to practice, but that's not really deliberate practice. That's not the kind of practice that's going to make you better quickly. What makes you better quickly is focusing on the parts of the pieces that you can't do well, focusing on exercises, and figuring out what is giving you problems and how you can overcome them, how you can get over that, what in the book it's called the OK plateau.
Great, thank you. And final question here. Yeah.
Memory palace is akin to Edward de Bono's mind maps, but just learning to keep the maps in the brain rather than putting them down on paper.
And so she's asking about mind maps, which is this study technique that is, I think, fairly popular. My impression is fairly popular in England. I don't know if it's popular here. Certainly it hasn't really made its way to America. And the idea there is basically to engage as much as you can with this kind of visual, spatial memory in the process of making maps on pieces of paper to connect ideas and outline things. And so yes, it is kind of akin to a memory palace on paper in that sense, in that it's engaging the same basic principles of what makes stuff memorable.
So that's just to end. I mean, why Moonwalking with Einstein?
So Moonwalking with Einstein refers to a memory device that I used when I was training to memorize some playing cards. Hopefully, it's a memorable title. If you picture in your mind's eye, and everybody should take a moment to do this, Einstein with a big white fro, and he's wearing like a diamond-studded white glove and penny loafers, and he's dancing backwards across the dance floor. Maybe he grabs his crotch at the end and, does a twirl. Hopefully that image will stick in your mind. Maybe it'll even make you want to buy the book. That was the idea.
Great, thank you. As I said, there is an opportunity. We have a limited number of copies of the book here, if you're interested in having Josh sign a copy. And that just leaves me to ask you to join me in giving a very warm thank you to Joshua Foer.